A small orphan, abandoned by circumstance, became an unlikely hero in nature's cruelest storm. The blizzard that threatened to claim 2 lives instead forged a bond that would transcend cultural divides and shake a community to its core. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The winter of 1873 descended upon Red River Crossing with merciless intent, transforming the Brazilian frontier settlement into a realm of ice and bone-deep silence. Each gust of wind swept through the southern plains like a scythe, threatening to erase any memory of warmth from the minds of those who called this harsh land home. Joel Silva, a 13-year-old orphan with eyes that had witnessed more suffering than most adults, moved like a phantom between the abandoned barns that dotted the outskirts of town. His thin frame bent perpetually against the relentless storm, shoulders hunched beneath a coat that had belonged to someone else long ago. The garment, several sizes too large, offered little protection against the biting cold that painted his cheeks and nose a raw red. Each morning before dawn, João would venture out to check his rabbit snares, the crude traps representing his primary means of survival. His fingers, blue and stiff from exposure, worked with practiced efficiency despite the pain. Hunger had become his constant companion, a ghost that hollowed his cheeks and sharpened his gaze. The townsfolk of Red River Crossing acknowledged his existence with varying degrees of, but mostly they looked through him rather than at him, their eyes sliding past as though the orphan boy were merely another feature of the harsh landscape. Boy, they called him when they needed something carried or cleaned. Rarely João, almost never his full name. He had become accustomed to this half-existence, this life on the periphery. The abandoned barns offered shelter from the worst of the weather, and his snares provided just enough sustenance to keep starvation at bay. He had learned to move silently, to take up little space, to survive without being seen. Some nights, when the cold became too fierce to bear alone, he would creep to the back door of Dona Maria's boarding house. The older woman, with her weathered hands and sharp tongue, never turned him away, though she grumbled about another mouth to feed. She would place before him whatever remained from the evening meal, watching with veiled concern as he devoured every morsel. "You're getting too thin," she would mutter, pressing an extra piece of bread into his palm before shooing him toward the small cot near the kitchen stove. These rare moments of kindness sustained João through the endless winter days as he drifted like a shadow along the snowy streets of a town that barely acknowledged his existence. The blizzard descended like a hungry beast, devouring the horizon in minutes. João Silva had been tracking rabbit prints for over an hour, venturing farther from Red River Crossing than wisdom allowed. The sudden darkness at midday was his first warning. Then came the wall of white, rushing across the southern plains with terrifying speed. "Sweet Mother of God," he whispered, the words instantly torn from his lips by the howling wind. The 13-year-old orphan stood frozen for precious seconds, watching his own footprints disappear under fresh snow. Panic fluttered in his chest like a trapped bird. The nearest shelter, an abandoned trapper's cabin, was at least 2 miles back, and already he could barely see 10 feet ahead. João pulled his thin jacket tighter, knowing it offered little protection against what was coming. The temperature plummeted as the storm engulfed him completely. His world contracted to a sphere of swirling white, disorienting and absolute. Each breath became a struggle, ice crystals forming on his eyelashes and the worn rabbit fur mittens that covered his reddening hands. He turned back toward town, using the wind direction as his only guide. The plains that had seemed so familiar that morning were now an alien landscape, featureless and hostile. The boy stumbled forward, counting steps to keep his mind from the growing numbness in his toes. 100 steps, 200. Was he even moving in the right direction anymore? Then, cutting through the storm's roar, came a sound that stopped him mid-stride. A high, thin wail, unmistakably human. A child's voice. João turned his head, straining to locate the source. The cry came again, weaker this time, somewhere to his right. Most adults in Red River Crossing would have pressed on, focused solely on their own survival. The winter of 1873 had already claimed 6 lives in their small community. Another blizzard victim would hardly be remarkable. But João hesitated, his own desperate circumstances momentarily forgotten. He knew what it meant to be alone, forgotten, invisible to those who might help. Since his parents' deaths, he had drifted through town like a ghost, surviving on scraps and odd jobs, sleeping in barns when Dona Maria's boarding house had no room for charity. The cry came a third time, fainter still. João closed his eyes, calculating his chances. Following that voice might lead him further from safety, deeper into the storm's embrace. Yet something pulled at him, perhaps the memory of his own unanswered cries in the darkness. Without further deliberation, he turned toward the sound and pushed forward against the blinding snow, each step taking him away from the known path and into the heart of the blizzard. Beyond the frozen river, 3 miles away, lay the encampment of the local Guarani community. The settlers of Red River Crossing spoke of it only in hushed tones, their voices dropping whenever the subject arose. João Silva had heard fragments of these conversations while sweeping floors or delivering messages, words like territory and hunting grounds that meant little to a boy whose world extended only as far as his next meal. The tensions had flared in recent months. Twice, João had seen the sheriff ride out with 4 men to meet Guarani representatives at the riverbank. The discussion seemed tense, with hands often resting near weapons. Dona Maria had explained that both communities claimed the same hunting areas, precious territory in the harsh winter months when game grew scarce. They were here first, she'd told João one evening while ladling thin soup into his bowl. But people forget that when their children are hungry. Her eyes had grown distant then, as if seeing beyond the walls of her modest boarding house to some complicated truth. João understood hunger intimately. It was a constant companion that hollowed his stomach and sharpened his senses. Perhaps that's why the desperate cry carried on the wind cut through him so deeply. It spoke a language he recognized, transcending the barriers of words and customs. The boy paused, snow swirling around his thin frame. The sensible choice was clear. Turn back toward town, seek shelter, survive. No one would blame an orphan for protecting himself. No one would even know he'd heard the cry. Yet something pulled him forward toward that sound of distress. Perhaps it was the memory of his own mother's voice, fading into silence during that terrible fever 2 years ago. Or maybe it was simply that João, having known what it meant to be invisible to others, could not bear to leave another soul unseen. He took a step forward, then another, each footprint marking a choice that would ripple outward in ways he couldn't imagine. This simple act, a boy moving toward danger rather than away, would soon alter the relationship between 2 communities that had viewed each other with suspicion for generations. What happened next would reshape not just João's own life, but the entire future of Red River Crossing. A single act of compassion would bridge a divide that guns and treaties could not, altering the fabric of 2 worlds. Neither the townsfolk nor the Guarani could have predicted that their fates would hinge on the courage of a 13-year-old orphan boy, trudging forward through a merciless blizzard toward a voice only he had heard. The blizzard intensified with each step João Silva took, transforming the familiar landscape into an alien wasteland. What had been rolling prairie hours before was now a sea of white, with snowdrifts rising taller than a grown man. The wind, relentless and cruel, sculpted the frozen terrain into waves that shifted and changed with each passing minute, erasing any hope of maintaining bearings. João pulled his thin jacket tighter, the fabric offering little protection against the biting cold. Years of surviving alone had taught him to read the weather's moods. How clouds gathered before a storm, how animals sought shelter, how the very air changed its scent. These skills had kept him alive when other orphans had succumbed to winter's harsh embrace. Today, those same instincts screamed danger, yet he pressed forward. His boots, patched and worn from seasons of use, had long since surrendered to the wet. Each step brought the agony of frozen toes, a pain he'd grown accustomed to during Red River Crossing's brutal winters. The orphan flexed his fingers inside his rabbit fur mittens, fighting the numbness that threatened to claim his extremities. "Just keep moving," he whispered to himself, the words immediately swallowed by the howling wind. The small rabbit hanging from his belt represented 6 hours of checking snares in the worsening conditions. Its meager meat would barely sustain him for a day, but in the depths of winter, even this modest prize meant survival. João had learned long ago not to expect more. Life had never been generous to him. He paused briefly, turning his back to the wind to catch his breath. From this position, he could no longer see the town behind him, nor anything ahead except the endless white void. The southern plains of Brazil, normally so alive with color and movement, had been rendered colorless and still, as if the world itself had died. The boy wiped ice from his eyelashes, remembering Dona Maria's warnings about travelers who had lost their way in storms like this. The boarding house owner had described how they were found come spring, perfectly preserved in snow, looking as if they had simply lain down to rest. João had no intention of becoming such a story. He adjusted the rabbit at his belt and forced his legs to move again, each step a deliberate act of will. The orphan had survived 13 harsh years through stubborn determination, and this blizzard would not claim him, not today. He lowered his head against the stinging ice particles and continued his journey, alone in a world that had vanished beneath winter's unforgiving blanket. The storm howled with a voice that seemed almost human. João Silva had heard Dona Maria speak of such things on the long winter nights at her boarding house. The old woman would lean close to the fire, her weathered hands wrapped around a steaming mug, and tell stories that made the children huddle together. "In blizzards like this," she would whisper, her eyes reflecting the dancing flames, "the wind carries the voices of those who were lost to the cold. They call out, hoping someone will answer and guide them home." The orphan had always nodded politely, but secretly thought these were just tales to keep children from wandering too far in winter. Now, as he trudged through knee-deep snow with the world reduced to a swirling white void, he wasn't so certain. The wind seemed to whisper words just beyond understanding, sometimes rising to a wail that prickled the hair on his neck. João pulled his thin jacket tighter, though it did little against the biting cold. The storm had transformed the familiar landscape into something alien and treacherous. Sky and earth had merged into a single white expanse, erasing all landmarks. Only the persistent push of wind against his left cheek gave him any sense of direction. His fingers had long since lost feeling, despite the rabbit fur mittens he'd crafted last autumn. The numbness was creeping past his wrists now, a dangerous sign he recognized from winters spent without proper shelter. João flexed his hands inside the mittens, trying to force blood back into his fingertips, but they remained stubbornly unresponsive. He thought of the boarding house, of Dona Maria's kitchen with its perpetual pot of beans simmering on the stove. She would sometimes slip him an extra portion when no one was looking, one of the few kindnesses he could count on in Red River Crossing. The memory of warmth seemed impossibly distant now. The wind shifted suddenly, driving ice crystals against his face with renewed fury. João turned slightly, adjusting his path to keep the wind at the same angle. Getting lost meant death in these conditions, a fact every child in the settlement learned before they could properly speak. Through the ghostly moans of the blizzard, he thought he heard something different, a sound that didn't belong to the storm. Joao paused, his breath forming a frozen cloud before his face. He waited, straining to hear past the wind's constant assault. There it was again. Not the wind, not the spirits Dona Maria spoke of. A child's cry, faint but unmistakable, carried on the merciless currents of the storm. Frostbite haunted every settler in the southern plains of Brazil, claiming fingers and toes with merciless efficiency each winter. For Joe Silva, with his threadbare jacket and pants that exposed his ankles to the biting cold, the threat was even more immediate. The orphan had survived 3 winters at Red River Crossing through cunning and determination. But this blizzard was unlike any he had endured before. The cry pierced through the howling wind again, sharper this time, a desperate plea that sliced through the white curtain of snow. Joe stopped, his frozen breath hanging in the air before being whipped away by the gale. His survival instincts screamed at him to continue toward town, to seek shelter before his limbs became useless from cold. "Hello?" he called, his voice swallowed by the storm. No response came except the wind's mournful wail. The young trapper weighed his options with the cold calculation of someone who had faced death before. The rabbit secured at his belt would provide a meager meal, but at least it was something. If he turned toward that cry, he might never make it back. His fingers, even inside the rabbit fur mittens he had crafted himself, were beginning to lose sensation. The first warning sign. Joao knew the stories Dona Maria told on bitter nights at the boarding house. Tales of settlers found frozen stiff as boards, their eyes open to the sky. The boarding house owner had taken pity on him occasionally, allowing him to sleep in her kitchen when temperatures plummeted below freezing. But he couldn't count on her finding him out here. The cry came a third time, weaker now. Joao closed his eyes briefly. Who would miss him if he disappeared today? The townsfolk barely acknowledged his existence, averting their gaze when he walked past. Senor Costa might wonder why no one came to trade rabbits for salt, but would likely shrug and continue his business. There would be no search parties, no tears shed. Yet somehow, this thought didn't fill him with self-pity. Instead, it crystallized his decision. If no one would mourn him, then the risk was his alone to take. And perhaps whoever was calling out there had someone waiting, someone who would grieve their absence. With a deep breath that burned his lungs with cold, Joao turned away from the faint lights of Red River Crossing and stepped toward the sound, each footfall sinking deep into the virgin snow. The wind pushed against him as if testing his resolve, but the orphan leaned forward, his thin frame bending like a reed rather than breaking. "I'm coming," he shouted, though he knew his words wouldn't carry. Still, the promise gave him purpose as he trudged deeper into the white void. 20 minutes of blind struggle through the storm brought Joao Silva to a shallow ravine he'd never encountered before. The wind had carved the snow into strange formations, revealing glimpses of the depression that normally wouldn't be visible in this featureless winter landscape. There, partially buried beneath a growing blanket of white, lay a small bundle of leather and fur that trembled ever so slightly. A little girl, no older than 9. The orphan knelt beside her, his own hunger and exhaustion momentarily forgotten. His numb fingers worked quickly to brush away the snow that threatened to claim her. As the ice fell away, he revealed her brown skin now tinged with an alarming bluish hue, and hair stiffened by frost. She wore traditional Guarani clothing with intricate beadwork that stood out even in the blinding whiteness surrounding them. Her eyelids, crusted with ice, fluttered at his touch. When they finally opened, Joao saw pure terror in those dark eyes, the look of someone certain they were about to die alone in the wilderness. But as she focused on his face, that fear transformed into something else, a desperate, fragile hope. The boy tried to speak, his voice cracking from the cold. "You're safe now," he said. though he wasn't sure if that was true for either of them. He doubted she understood Portuguese, but perhaps his tone would convey what words couldn't. João glanced around, searching for any sign of adults or an encampment, but saw only the endless white void of the blizzard. The Guarani settlement was supposed to be miles away, near the river. How had such a young child wandered so far in these conditions? The girl's lips moved, forming words he couldn't understand, but her trembling had grown more violent, a worrying sign that her body was fighting desperately against the cold. João knew from harsh experience that this violent shivering was better than the eerie stillness that preceded death, but it wouldn't last forever. He had to act quickly. Despite his own thinning reserves of strength, the orphan removed his outer layer, a patched jacket that had seen better days, and wrapped it around the child's shoulders. The bitter cold immediately bit deeper into his bones, but he pushed the discomfort aside. For the first time in years, someone needed him more than he needed to survive. The girl's eyes remained fixed on his face, a silent question in them that transcended language. João nodded reassuringly as he prepared to lift her from the snow. Whatever brought her here, wherever she belonged, those questions could wait. Right now, there was only the storm, the cold, and two children fighting to survive it together. The girl's eyelashes were white with frost, delicate crystals forming along each hair like tiny pearls. Her small hands clutched a leather pouch, decorated with intricate symbols, geometric patterns, and stylized animals that João Silva had never seen before. The craftsmanship spoke of tradition and meaning beyond his understanding. Something sacred, perhaps. She wore beautifully crafted moccasins with Guarani beadwork, blue and red patterns that stood out against the snow's blinding whiteness. Her lips, tinged blue from the cold, moved in a language foreign to João's ears, the sounds melodic yet urgent. Though he couldn't understand her words, the desperate plea for mamãe needed no translation. The universal cry of a child for her mother transcended their language barrier. The orphan scanned the vast white landscape, searching for any sign of adults or tracks that might have been covered by the relentless snowfall. Nothing but the endless white wilderness answered his gaze. No movement disturbed the snow-laden branches of distant trees. No smoke rose on the horizon. The blizzard had swallowed everything, leaving only this small girl and himself in a world of white. "It's okay," João said softly in Portuguese, knowing she wouldn't understand his words, but hoping his gentle tone might offer some comfort. He mimicked drinking and eating, trying to ask if she needed either. The child watched him with wary, intelligent eyes, her body trembling violently. Without hesitation, João removed his thin jacket, his only real protection against the brutal cold, and wrapped it around her shoulders. The frigid air immediately bit deeper into his bones, but he ignored the pain. Survival in Red River Crossing had taught him that sometimes suffering was necessary. The girl's need was greater than his own. She looked at him with confusion, then understanding dawned in her eyes. She clutched the jacket tightly around herself, murmuring something that sounded like gratitude. The beaded leather pouch remained firmly in her grip, clearly too precious to let go even for a moment. João pointed toward the direction of town, then at himself, then at her, trying to communicate his intention to bring her to safety. The wind howled around them, drowning out his words, but the message seemed to reach her. She nodded once, her expression solemn beyond her years. As he helped her to her feet, João noticed she favored her right leg. Frostbite had likely already begun its cruel work. They needed shelter soon, or neither would survive the night. The boy who had always fended only for himself now found himself responsible for another life, and strangely, the burden felt like purpose. Her body trembled violently against the bitter cold. A good sign, João thought, remembering what the old trappers had taught him. Trembling meant life still fought within her small frame. It was the stillness, the peaceful surrender to cold, that preceded death in these merciless winters. João Silva worked with practiced efficiency, his survival instincts taking over. He gently took her tiny hands between his own and began rubbing them, careful not to be too rough with the delicate, frozen skin. Then, reaching for the rabbit he'd caught earlier that morning, he gutted it quickly with his small knife. Steam rose from the fresh carcass, carrying precious warmth. "This will hurt," he whispered in Portuguese, knowing she wouldn't understand his words, but hoping his gentle tone would reassure her. The Guarani girl watched him with wide, frightened eyes as he pressed her frozen fingers against the warm interior of the freshly killed animal. It was an old trapper's remedy against frostbite, one he'd learned from necessity rather than choice. The warmth from the rabbit's body would slowly bring life back to her extremities, without the shocking pain of direct heat, which could damage frozen flesh beyond repair. The child winced, but didn't cry out. Her resilience surprised him. Most children from town would have been wailing by now, but she merely bit her lower lip, her dark eyes fixed on his face with a mixture of fear and trust. When he deemed her fingers had received enough warmth, João carefully lifted the girl. He was shocked by how little she weighed. Her frame was so light that even his 13-year-old arms could carry her without strain. Through her leather and fur clothing, he could feel her ribs prominently. "You're hungry too," he murmured, recognizing the familiar signs. Starvation was no stranger to either of them. The settlers of Red River Crossing often went hungry during harsh winters when supplies dwindled. But João knew the Guarani community beyond the frozen river suffered equally. Game became scarce, preserved foods ran low, and the weak perished before spring's return. It was a shadow that haunted both their peoples, this constant dance with hunger. João had seen it in the hollow cheeks of town children, and now recognized it in this girl's fragile body. Despite their differences, language, culture, the invisible boundaries adults had drawn, they shared this fundamental struggle for survival. The girl's eyes fluttered, exhaustion threatening to overcome her. João adjusted his grip, cradling her closer to share what little body heat he possessed. They would need to move soon if either of them hoped to survive the blizzard. But for this moment, he allowed her the brief respite of being held safe. João Silva wrapped the Guarani girl in his tattered woolen scarf, carefully tucking frayed edges around her trembling shoulders. He pressed her small body against his chest, creating a fragile sanctuary of warmth against the merciless winter storm. The bitter cold gnawed at his exposed skin like a hungry predator, but he had endured harsher conditions since becoming an orphan. 3 winters on the streets of Red River Crossing had hardened him against suffering that would break most children. "We'll make it," he whispered, more to himself than to her, as his eyes strained to follow their rapidly disappearing footprints. Each passing minute brought another layer of snow, erasing the trail that might lead them to safety. The blizzard showed no signs of relenting, its howling voice drowning out all other sounds across the frozen landscape. The young orphan shifted the girl's weight, adjusting his grip to shield her face from the worst of the wind. Her breathing had steadied against him, no longer the shallow, panicked gasps from when he'd first discovered her half buried in the ravine. Her small hands clutched the fabric of his shirt with surprising strength, fingers occasionally tightening when a particularly violent gust threatened to separate them. João felt an unfamiliar warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with physical heat. For years, his existence had narrowed to the brutal simplicity of survival, finding food, seeking shelter, avoiding danger. Each day had been a solitary battle against hunger and the elements, with no one to care whether he lived or died. Now, cradling this stranger's child against the storm, he felt something awakening inside him that had long been dormant. Someone else's survival suddenly mattered more than his own. The realization struck him with unexpected force. If he fell now, it wouldn't just be another nameless orphan disappearing from Red River Crossing. This girl, this daughter of the Guarani people, would perish with him. The thought steeled his resolve as he pushed forward through snow that reached his knees. "Just a little farther," he murmured in Portuguese, knowing she couldn't understand his words, but hoping his tone might comfort her. Her dark eyes, rimmed with frost on her lashes, looked up at him with complete trust that made his throat tighten. João adjusted their course slightly, using the wind's direction to maintain orientation. Somewhere ahead lay the town, Dona Maria's boarding house, warmth and safety. He just had to keep moving, one painful step after another, carrying his precious burden through the white void that threatened to consume them both. The wind shifted without warning, lashing João and the Guarani child with icy needles that felt like tiny daggers against their exposed skin. João Silva instinctively turned his body, creating a human shield for the girl. His thin frame offered little protection, but it was all he had to give. The relentless cold had already taken its toll. His right eye had frozen shut, narrowing his vision to a painful slit through which the endless white seemed to mock his efforts. "Stay close," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if she understood his words. The orphan tightened his grip around her small shoulders, feeling her trembling beneath the inadequate layers. His legs burned with the peculiar fire that extreme cold brings. A sensation like molten metal poured into his muscles with each labored step. The knee-deep snow created a brutal resistance, as if the winter itself were determined to claim them both. João's breath came in ragged clouds that the wind tore away instantly. 13 years of hardship had taught him endurance, but never had he pushed himself so far beyond his limits. The girl pressed against his side suddenly began to murmur something, soft, melodic sounds that rose through the howling wind. It wasn't simply random words, but something structured and beautiful. A prayer, perhaps, or a song passed down through generations of her people. The Guarani melody continued, somehow maintaining its delicate pattern despite her chattering teeth and trembling lips. João listened, finding unexpected strength in the gentle cadence. Though he couldn't understand a single word, the sound created a tiny pocket of humanity in the vast, uncaring wilderness. For a moment, he forgot the pain in his frost-bitten toes and the terrible numbness creeping up his limbs. "That's good," he encouraged her, his voice barely audible above the storm. "Keep singing." She looked up at him with eyes that held both fear and a surprising resilience. Her small hand found his, squeezing with what little strength remained in her tiny fingers. In that moment, João realized they were sustaining each other, the orphan boy and the chief's granddaughter, strangers from worlds that rarely met except in conflict. Another brutal gust nearly knocked them sideways. João steadied himself, planting his feet more firmly despite the agony that shot through his ankles. The town had to be close now. It had to be. He forced his good eye to scan the white horizon, searching for any landmark that might guide them to safety. The girl's song faltered as a particularly vicious blast of wind cut through them, but she drew a deep breath and continued, her voice becoming their lifeline in the frozen chaos of the Brazilian winter. João hummed a gentle melody, the same lullaby his mother had sung to him before illness claimed her. The notes drifted through the howling wind, creating a small sanctuary of humanity amid nature's fury. The Guarani girl nestled against his chest, her breathing synchronized with the rhythm of his song. "My mother taught me this," he whispered, though he knew she couldn't understand his words. The connection between them transcended language. Two children abandoned to the mercy of the elements, finding strength in each other. Time became meaningless as the blizzard raged on. The numbness that had started in João's toes now crept upward like an invisible tide, claiming his ankles, then his calves. His chest tightened as the cold penetrated deeper, each breath becoming more labored than the last. Still, he pressed forward, one agonizing step after another. The orphan's thoughts drifted to Donna Maria's kitchen, the only place in Red River Crossing where he'd ever felt welcome. The memory of warmth seemed impossibly distant now, like something from another life. He wondered if he would ever feel that warmth again, or if the storm would claim them both, erasing their brief existence from the world's memory. Twice, Joao's legs betrayed him. His knees buckled under the combined weight of exhaustion and his precious cargo, sending him crashing into the snow. The first time, he managed to twist his body to protect the girl from impact. The second time, he simply collapsed, his muscles refusing to obey. Just a moment's rest, he thought, the temptation to close his eyes nearly overwhelming. The snow felt almost comfortable now, a dangerous sign he recognized from stories of those who had surrendered to winter's embrace. Then, something unexpected happened. The Guarani child raised her small hand and pressed it gently against his frost-nipped cheek. Her touch was surprisingly warm, her dark eyes meeting his with a calm acceptance that seemed beyond her years. She didn't speak, but her gesture conveyed everything. I trust you. I believe in you. That silent faith ignited something within João Silva that the cold couldn't touch. With a groan that tore from deep in his chest, he forced himself back to his feet. His body screamed in protest, but his resolve hardened like ice. "We'll make it," he promised her, resuming his halting journey through the white wasteland. "We'll make it together." The storm continued its assault, but now two hearts beat in defiance of its fury. One small act of human connection becoming their shield against the merciless winter of 1873. A miracle appeared through the swirling white void, a weathered fence post jutting from the snow like a sentinel, its familiar shape telling João Silva they had reached the outskirts of Red River Crossing. The boy's heart leaped with desperate hope as he recognized this boundary marker that separated town property from the open plains. He veered along the fence line, using it as a lifeline through the blinding storm. Each step had become a battle against nature itself. João's legs trembled beneath him, muscles burning from hours of trudging through knee-deep drifts while carrying the Guarani child. His breath came in ragged gasps, visible in the freezing air before being whipped away by the relentless wind. The cold had penetrated so deeply that he could no longer feel his toes inside his worn boots. The girl stirred against his chest, her small body shivering despite being wrapped in his scarf. Her eyes, which had remained half-closed for much of their journey, suddenly widened. She raised one trembling hand and pointed urgently ahead, making a sound that rose above the howling blizzard. João squinted through ice-crusted eyelashes, straining to see what had caught her attention. A dark, angular shape gradually materialized through the curtain of snow. Donna Maria's old barn. The orphan had slept there on many nights when the boarding house was full, or when he'd returned too late from checking his traps. Now it stood before them like a fortress of salvation. "We're almost there," he whispered, though he knew the girl couldn't understand his words. The tone of relief in his voice seemed to comfort her nonetheless. The final 100 meters stretched before them like an endless plain. João's body was failing him, each movement requiring conscious effort as numbness spread through his limbs. The wind seemed determined to push them backward, as if the storm itself were a living entity fighting to claim them. 50 meters, 25. The barn grew larger, more substantial. 10 meters remained when João's knees buckled. He caught himself, refusing to fall with his precious cargo. 5 meters, 3, 1. With the last of his strength, the boy crashed against the wooden wall of the structure, the impact barely registering through his numbed body. His frozen fingers fumbled clumsily with the latch, scraping against the metal until blood appeared, though he couldn't feel the pain. The door resisted, its bottom edge frozen to the ground. João threw his shoulder against it with a desperate grunt. Once, twice, on the third attempt, The ice cracked and the door swung inward. They tumbled inside as one, the relative silence after the storm's constant roar almost deafening in its suddenness. The barn door slammed shut behind them, cutting off the howling wind and leaving them in a darkness that, for the first time in hours, promised safety rather than death. Inside the barn, the howling wind became a distant memory, though the temperature was barely warmer than outside. João Silva carefully laid the Guarani girl in a soft pile of hay, his entire body now convulsing with violent shivers. His fingers had turned an alarming shade of purple, and his teeth chattered so hard he feared they might crack. "Stay," he managed to whisper, though he knew she couldn't understand his words. The orphan's legs trembled beneath him as he stumbled around the barn, searching for anything that might help them survive the night. In the corner, partially hidden beneath old farm tools, he discovered a wooden chest he recognized as one of Donna Maria's emergency supplies. The boarding house owner had always been practical about winter preparations, insisting that every outbuilding have basic necessities. João silently thanked her foresight as his numb fingers struggled with the simple latch. Inside lay treasures more valuable than gold: 3 thick horse blankets, a small tin of matches, a glass lantern with oil still inside, and a half-full flask of cachaça. The orphan's hands shook so badly that it took 4 attempts to strike a match successfully. When the lantern finally cast its warm glow across the barn, he felt a small victory against the merciless cold. The girl watched him with wide, frightened eyes, her small body curled tightly against itself. When João approached with the light, he noticed her left foot had taken on a grayish-white appearance, the unmistakable sign of frostbite beginning to set in. His stomach knotted with worry. He'd seen old trappers lose toes to the winter's bite. He knelt beside her, pointing to her foot and then to the lantern, trying to communicate his intentions. She nodded slightly, understanding despite their language barrier. João carefully removed her beaded moccasin, wincing at how cold her skin felt beneath his touch. The foot was stiff, with white patches spreading across her toes, not yet the black of dead tissue, but dangerously close. The boy positioned the lantern nearby, allowing its modest heat to radiate toward her injured foot. He wrapped one blanket around her shoulders and another around her legs, leaving her foot exposed to the gentle warmth. His own comfort could wait. He'd survived worse nights than this. As he worked, the barn creaked and groaned under the storm's assault. Snow forced its way through gaps in the wooden walls, creating small white piles on the dirt floor. Outside, the blizzard continued its rage, but in this humble shelter, 2 children from different worlds had found a fragile sanctuary against nature's fury. João Silva's hands trembled as he uncapped the flask of cachaça, the pungent aroma filling the small space between them. The clear liquid sloshed against the metal cap as he carefully measured a small amount. "Drink," he whispered, holding it to Iara's blue-tinged lips. The Guarani girl eyed the liquid suspiciously, her dark eyes wide with uncertainty. João nodded encouragingly, mimicking a drinking motion. Understanding dawned on her face, and she reluctantly accepted the offering. The moment the cachaça touched her tongue, Iara's face contorted. She gagged violently, nearly spitting it out, but somehow managed to swallow. The orphan offered an apologetic smile, knowing the burning sensation all too well from the rare occasions Dona Maria had given him a cap for medicinal purposes. "It helps," he explained in Portuguese, knowing she couldn't understand his words, but hoping his tone conveyed reassurance. The warming effect of the alcohol would help fight the cold from within. With gentle movements, João examined her foot again. The skin had taken on a grayish-white appearance, the telltale sign of frostbite. He'd seen it before on old trappers who'd lost toes and fingers to winter's cruel bite. Taking a deep breath, he poured a small amount of the spirit over the affected area. Iara's scream pierced the barn's stillness. She jerked backward, tears streaming down her face as the alcohol burned against damaged tissue. But the cry was a blessing in disguise. Pain meant nerve endings still lived, that the frostbite hadn't completely destroyed the tissue. "I'm sorry," Joao murmured, squeezing her hand. "I'm sorry." Working quickly, he gathered the horse blankets piled in the corner, creating a nest of rough wool and canvas. The materials were scratchy, but would trap precious heat. He guided the shivering child into this makeshift cocoon before climbing in beside her, wrapping the layers tightly around them both. The agony of returning circulation hit him like 1,000 needles, stabbing simultaneously into his extremities. Joao bit his lip until he tasted blood, determined not to cry out. His suffering would only frighten the girl more. Instead, he focused on the rhythm of her breathing, gradually slowing as warmth began to return to their bodies. Iara whimpered softly, her small frame shuddering against his. Joao recognized the pain of thawing flesh, a torment that felt worse than the freezing itself. He hummed the same lullaby from earlier, a melody his mother had sung before illness took her 3 winters ago. Outside, the blizzard continued its assault. But inside their fragile shelter, 2 children from different worlds shared the same battle against nature's cruelty. Gradually, the color returned to Iara's foot, angry red replacing deathly white, a small victory against the merciless cold that had nearly claimed them both. Iara's quiet whimpers echoed through the barn, each sound piercing Joao's heart. The small Guarani girl clutched the leather pouch with tribal symbols against her chest as waves of pain washed over her. Joao recognized this torment, the burning sensation of blood returning to frozen limbs, a cruel mercy that meant survival. "It will pass," he whispered in Portuguese, knowing she wouldn't understand his words, but hoping his tone might offer comfort. The orphan had endured this agony before. During his first winter alone, when no one had taught him how to properly protect himself from the cold, the barn's ancient timbers groaned under the blizzard's relentless assault. Wind found every gap in the weathered planks, forcing snow through the cracks like ghostly fingers reaching inside their sanctuary. These intrusions painted delicate white lines across the dirt floor, creating patterns that reminded Joao of the river in spring, beautiful yet threatening. He adjusted the horse blankets around them, creating a tighter cocoon of warmth. The rough wool scratched against his skin, but the discomfort was nothing compared to the biting cold outside. The lantern's flame danced with each new gust that found its way inside, casting wavering shadows that seemed to breathe with the storm. Hours crawled by in near silence, broken only by their shivering breaths and occasional whimpers. Joao found himself humming fragments of lullabies his mother had sung before illness had claimed her 3 winters ago. The melodies came back in pieces, like half-remembered dreams. The girl eventually grew quiet, her breathing steadier as exhaustion pulled her towards sleep. Joao carefully checked her foot again, relief washing over him as he noticed pink returning to replace the grayish-white of frostbite. The color's return was a small victory against the merciless cold, vital proof that she might keep all her toes. His own feet throbbed painfully, but he focused instead on the flask of cachaça Donna Maria had stored in the emergency chest. The boarding house owner had always been kind to him, offering odd jobs when others in town looked through him as if he were invisible. This barn had been his shelter more than once when winter turned particularly vicious. Outside, the storm's voice began to change, its howling fury gradually softening to a persistent moan. Joao knew the blizzard was finally spending itself, its strength diminishing with the approaching dawn. Iara stirred against him, her small hand finding his in the darkness. Her fingers, warm now, squeezed his with surprising strength. No words passed between them, but in that simple gesture, Joao felt something he hadn't experienced since becoming an orphan: connection. The first light of dawn filtered through the cracks of the barn's weathered planks, painting thin golden lines across the hay-strewn floor. The storm had finally exhausted itself, leaving behind an eerie silence broken only by the occasional creak of settling timber. João Silva had managed to keep both himself and the girl alive through the night, though exhaustion had settled deep in his bones. Without warning, the barn door burst open with a shower of snow. Dona Maria stood framed in the doorway, her gray hair wild around her face, eyes wide with shock. She had been searching frantically since first light, following half-buried footprints that led to her own property. "Blessed Virgin Mary," she gasped, rushing toward the bundle of blankets. "I thought you were dead, boy." The boarding house owner knelt beside them, her weathered hands quickly assessing their condition. The Guarani child shrank back in fear, but Joao's reassuring nod seemed to calm her. "Come now, both of you," Dona Maria commanded, her voice booking no argument. "This is no place for children." With surprising strength for her age, she helped them to their feet and guided them through the knee-deep snow toward her small house. Inside her kitchen, warmth from the wood stove enveloped them like an embrace. Without ceremony, she stripped away their frozen garments, flicking her tongue at their blue-tinged skin. "You'll catch your death," she muttered, officially wrapping João in a worn flannel shirt and the girl in one of her own nightgowns, comically large on her small frame. As she worked, Dona Maria's eyes caught the distinctive beadwork pattern on the child's discarded moccasins. Her expression softened with recognition. She turned to the girl and spoke several halting phrases in Guarani, words learned from years of cautious trading with the indigenous community. The effect was immediate. Tears welled in the child's eyes, and she responded in a rapid stream of words. Though Dona Maria understood little, the relief in the girl's face spoke volumes. "She says her name is Yara," the older woman translated for João. "She was gathering winter herbs with her mother when they became separated in the storm." João nodded, watching as Dona Maria ladled steaming broth into 2 chipped bowls. The caretaker placed one in his trembling hands. "You did a brave thing," she said quietly, her eyes serious. "But there will be trouble. The Guarani will come looking, and not everyone in town will understand." João sipped the hot liquid, feeling strength return to his limbs. Outside, the sun had fully risen over a transformed landscape, pristine white, deceptively peaceful. He glanced at Yara, who had already drained her bowl, color returning to her cheeks. For the first time in years, the orphan felt something beyond mere survival: purpose. João Silva recounted the night's ordeal between sips of steaming broth, his voice barely above a whisper. His thin fingers trembled slightly around the earthenware bowl as he described finding Yara in the snow, carrying her through the blinding white wilderness. Dona Maria listened gravely, her weathered hands busy wringing out a cloth for the girl's forehead. "You did right, boy," she said quietly when he finished, though both knew some in town would not agree. The boarding house owner squeezed his shoulder, a rare gesture that made the orphan look up in surprise. Not many would risk themselves for a Guarani child. The aroma of herbs and broth filled the small kitchen, creating a fragile pocket of warmth against the lingering chill outside. Through the window, João could see the storm had finally broken, leaving behind a blinding white landscape under a clear blue sky. As news of the rescue spread, neighbors began arriving at Dona Maria's door. They stomped snow from their boots and huddled in the front room, casting wary glances at the Guarani girl who sat wrapped in blankets near the hearth. Yara returned their stares with quiet dignity beyond her years, clutching the leather pouch with tribal symbols to her chest. "What if they think we took her?" Senor Costa asked, his voice carrying from the doorway. The shopkeeper nervously twisted his cap in his hands. "The piece is fragile enough without this misunderstanding." "Would you rather the child had frozen to death?" Dona Maria challenged, her normally hospitable tone hardening as she placed herself between the townspeople and Yara. The room fell silent, except for the crackling of the fire. João noticed how the adults kept their distance from the girl, as if her difference might be contagious. It reminded him of how they had treated him when he first arrived, an outsider, unwelcome until proven useful. "The sheriff should be notified," someone suggested from the back of the room. "Already done," Donna Maria replied, "He'll be here shortly." Joao moved closer to Iara, feeling a strange responsibility toward her. The girl looked up at him and offered a small smile, the first he'd seen from her. Something passed between them, a wordless understanding born of shared survival. "When the weather clears," Senor Costa continued, "we should return her immediately, before there's trouble." Joao watched the adults debate Iara's fate as if she weren't present, their faces etched with the same fear he'd seen during previous conflicts with the Guarani. He wondered if they realized that the small girl sipping broth by the fire understood more than they thought, reading their expressions if not their words. Send her back where? Into another blizzard? Donna Maria snapped, her arms crossed defensively over her chest. The small kitchen had grown crowded as neighbors pressed in, their faces a mixture of concern and suspicion. The boarding house owner stood like a fortress between the Guarani child and the growing crowd of townspeople. The sheriff, his hair more white than black, nodded slowly. His weathered face showed the wisdom of decades mediating frontier disputes. "She stays until it's safe," he declared with quiet authority. "But we should expect visitors. The Guarani will come looking for one of their own." Senor Costa paced nervously by the window, peering out at the snow-covered street. "They might think we took her," the shopkeeper muttered. "Remember what happened to the Mendez family last spring?" A murmur rippled through the room. Everyone recalled the incident, a misunderstanding that had nearly sparked violence between the settlers and the indigenous community. The fragile peace that existed between Red River Crossing and the Guarani encampment hung by the thinnest of threads. Joao sat apart from the others, perched on a wooden stool in the corner. His clothes, now dry but still threadbare, hung loosely on his thin frame. The orphan watched Iara as she sipped broth from a clay bowl, her dark eyes occasionally meeting his with silent gratitude. The sheriff turned to Joao, his voice cutting through the anxious chatter. "Boy, I need to know exactly what you saw out there. Was the child alone? Did you see any other adults? Any signs of a hunting party?" The room fell silent, all eyes turning to the 13-year-old. Joao straightened his shoulders, unused to being the center of attention. For years, he had moved through town like a ghost, barely noticed by those around him. "No, senor," he replied quietly but clearly. "Only her. The snow had covered everything. I heard her crying and found her half buried in a ravine." He paused, recalling the empty white landscape. There were no tracks except those being covered by the storm. Donna Maria placed a protective hand on Joao's shoulder. "This boy risked his life," she reminded everyone. "While the rest of us were safe by our fires, he carried this child through a blizzard that would have killed most grown men." The sheriff nodded thoughtfully. "First light, I'll ride to the high ground. If the Guarani are searching, better we meet them halfway, with the child safe and well." He looked at Joao with newfound respect. "You'll need to come too, son. They'll want to hear your story." As dawn broke, an unfamiliar rhythm vibrated through the town, the thunder of hooves along the riverbank. 500 Guarani warriors lined the horizon, their silhouettes stark against the rising sun. They sat motionless on their mounts, weapons visible but not raised, their presence both magnificent and terrifying to the townspeople, who gathered at windows and doorways. The sheriff straightened his worn coat and gestured to Joao Silva, Donna Maria, and the little girl who now whispered her name, Iara, with renewed strength. The boy's thin frame still trembled from exhaustion, but he stood tall as they walked toward the frozen riverbank, snow crunching beneath their boots. "Stay behind me," the elderly lawman instructed, his white hair catching the morning light. But Joe moved forward instinctively when Iara tugged at his hand, her eyes fixed on the imposing line of warriors. Whispers rippled through the gathering townspeople. Senor Costa muttered about the fragile peace being broken, while others clutched hunting rifles with white-knuckled hands. Donna Maria silenced them with a stern glance, her practical nature cutting through their fear. From the center of the Guarani line, an elder dismounted with dignified grace. Tupac Costa, the chief, wore ceremonial furs and beadwork that marked his authority. His weathered face remained impassive as he approached, though his eyes never left his granddaughter. When Ayara broke free and ran to him, the tension cracked. Tupan knelt, embracing the child with such fierce tenderness that even the most suspicious settlers could recognize the universal language of family. The chief spoke soft words in Guarani, his hands gently examining her for injuries. Then, to everyone's surprise, Tupan Costa stood and approached João. The orphan, who had been invisible to most of Red River Crossing, now stood at the center of this historical moment. Uncertain but unwavering, "This boy saved my blood when others would have turned away," the chief announced in accented but clear Portuguese, ensuring all could understand. The Guarani do not forget such courage. From around his neck, Tupan removed a beaded necklace, intricate patterns of blue and white stones that caught the winter light. With ceremonial solemnity, he placed it over João's head, the meaningful weight settling against the boy's chest. "João Silva is now Karaipihare, Knight Protector, honored among our people," Tupan declared. "His actions have spoken louder than all the empty treaties between our peoples." The sheriff nodded respectfully, understanding the significance of this gesture. For the first time, João felt truly seen, not as an orphan to be pitied or ignored, but as someone whose choices mattered. As the warriors turned their horses to depart, Iara pressed something into João's palm, her leather pouch with Guarani symbols. A gift, a promise of continued connection. The boy who had once been invisible was now the bridge between two worlds, the memory of that blizzard forever changing the destiny of Red River Crossing.